stations and both TV satellite networks. Dish Network, channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and DirecTV, channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take as over 200 are in the United States, Latin America, Canada, Europe, and around the world. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We are joined by not only Laura Carlson, who is here with us from Las Cruces, New Mexico. She is with the organization that looks at Mexico and Latin America. She's with the group called the Center for International Policy. We're also with Greg Grandin, professor of Latin American history at NYU. His new forthcoming book is called Fordlandia. Paul Helmke is with us as well, president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. He's joining us from Washington. Juan?
Yes, I'd just like to ask Laura Carlson another question on the question of whether there is success occurring in this drug war in Mexico. On the one hand, you see the administration praising President Felipe Calderón and his initiatives. On the other hand, you see a continued rise in the supposed production of various types of drugs in Mexico, and also the role of the Mexicans who have been deported from the United States, from prisons here in the United States after they serve terms. Is there any indication that this is having an impact on the level of violence and of the upsurge in the drug trafficking in Mexico?
Well, first of all, it's very frustrating to see the way that these multiple failures of the drug war model that's been roundly criticized now by the United Nations in the drug war policy meetings in Vienna, as well as by a high-level commission called the Latin Commission on Drugs and Democracy, are continuously spun as successes. It's completely unacceptable to ask a society to accept higher levels of violence as a sign that we're winning the drug war. There's an increasing level of civilians that are being caught in the crossfire between the 45,000 army troops that are in the streets in Mexico and the drug cartels who are fighting for plazas. So this is very frustrating. We know that this model doesn't work because it's been applied before, and we know that it's not working in Mexico now. I don't think the deportees have as much to do with the rising violence as the deserters from the army. That's where there's a very serious problem. One of the items included in the Merida Initiative, a number of them have to do with increased training for the army and police forces. What we know is that with high desertion rates that we have in the Mexican army and the high levels of corruption in both the police and the army, much of that training is going to go straight to the drug cartels.
I wanted to go to right now to Washington, D.C. Our guest there is Paul Helmke, president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. These latest figures that we've just gone through, the number of weapons that are being used, something like 90% of them from the United States. Your piece, your organization's piece, America's Weak Gun Laws Are Fueling the Violence in Mexico. How?
It's the folks in Mexico have figured out what criminals in the U.S. figured out a long time ago. Our weak and nearly non-existent laws in the U.S. are making it very easy for these guns to get to Mexico. Most Americans don't realize that we basically have very few laws on the book, almost none, restricting access to guns. And so it's very easy to go to unlicensed dealers who basically can sell any kind of gun without any kind of background check, particularly at gun shows, particularly in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. They go to licensed dealers who are corrupt, and because Congress, in effect, shields them by keeping the information about where the records are, what the inventory is, who's in trouble, and making sure that ATF doesn't have the funding. That's where guns come from. And the fact that we allow an unlimited number of guns, almost any kind of gun, very serious military, nearly military-style hardware, it's obvious. That's why 90 to 95% of the guns are coming from the U.S. We are the world's gun bazaar, and the gangs in Mexico have figured it out. If anything, Mexico ought to be putting up their army at our border to check the cars coming from the U.S. in to see who's bringing the guns in, because we make it so easy for dangerous people to get those guns.
Now, I think your article mentions that about 1% of all the licensed gun dealers represent 60% of the illegal gun sales. Why doesn't the government crack down on those particular licensed dealers that are involved in this trafficking?
Seems pretty obvious to me. Actually, that information's a little old. Congress no longer allows that kind of information to be made public. That's from 2000, when it was said that 60% of the guns traced to crime come from 1% of the dealers. But we only have enough ATF agents. It would take them 21 years to investigate every gun dealer, to stop by every gun dealer in the U.S. And in fact, we have laws on the books that say once you've investigated a gun dealer, a licensed gun dealer in the U.S., you cannot come back again for another 12 months unless you have a warrant. We make it harder to sell cigarettes to minors or liquor to minors than we do to sell guns in this country. And since you can go in again with a credit card and buy 1,000 AK-47s, 50 caliber sniper rifles that can shoot down helicopters, it's obvious why they come to the U.S. to get their guns.
Paul
we do
Hoelke,
nothing to stop almost nothing to stop dangerous people from getting
I remember when President Bush first took office, and the statement of the NRA, we're now going to be operating out of the Oval Office.
Right.
Do you still see their power at that level today, and what do you feel needs to be done?
Clearly, we have a lot stronger supporters with President Obama, Vice President Biden, Attorney General Holder, Rahm Emanuel, others in the administration. Elected officials in Congress, however, are still scared to death of the NRA for some reason. They think that the NRA is powerful, even though the NRA basically hasn't won a single contested election in either the 06 cycle or the 08 cycle. We don't know of any person who's lost because of standing for common sense gun control over the last two elections, but a lot of politicians are afraid of them, even though when we poll people at exit polls, 75 to 85% of gun owners, McCain voters, Republicans, as well as the general American public support things like doing background checks on all sales, strengthening ATF so we can stop this illegal trading gun, restricting some of the weapons that are easily available to the general public.
And yet, even we covered, I think it was last week, that the passage of giving D.C. the right to have a voting member of Congress that was stuck into that bill, the elimination or the reduction of D.C.'s strong gun control laws.
Clearly sad. D.C.'s law was challenged. The Supreme Court spoke up last summer, said D.C. went too far. But the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia speaking, said you can still have restrictions on who gets guns, what types of guns, where you take guns, how they're sold, how they're marketed, how they're carried. But Congress thinks they know the Constitution better than the Supreme Court. And the Senate, sadly, the other week said that D.C. City Council didn't get it right. And so they want to play Super City Council in the sky and basically say you can't have a vote in Congress unless we can gut your gun laws totally. That's ridiculous, and it does show the power of the gun lobby.
Paul Hoelke, the case that just went on trial this week in Phoenix, Arizona, of a gun store owner who went on trial and charges he sold more than 700 weapons to straw buyers, knowing the firearms were bought on behalf of Mexican drug syndicates.
Right. Happens all the time. A straw buyer is someone who knows they can't pass a background check, so they get someone else. And basically, the straw buyer says, let me look at that gun. How much does it cost? How does it feel? And then they have someone else with them fill out the paperwork. Obvious straw buyers, we don't do enough in this country to crack down on that. And it's because, basically, we are not serious. We want everybody to have a gun for any purpose. That gun dealer actually was originally in California, which has the best gun laws in this country. And he moved to Arizona because it was too hard for him to sell those guns in California. And he knew that in Arizona it'd be a lot easier for him to market these to the gangs and the drug cartels in Mexico.
Greg Grandin is also with us, a professor of Latin American history at New York University, NYU here in New York, just down the road. Can you put the policy of the U.S. with Mexico in context overall in Latin America right now?
Well, the larger context is two things. One is the rise of the left throughout most of South America, in which the U.S. has lost influence in what used to be called its backyard. But also, and the reason for the rise of the left is the second part of the context, and that's the absolute failure of economic policy, starting with NAFTA and even before, it's generally known as neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus. All of the drug war is a crystallization of, in a lot of ways, of all of the pressures brought to bear on the Mexican state by privatization, by deregulation, through the opening up of the economy. In some ways, you see a direct relationship between the recession of the state, particularly in northern Mexico, and the vacuum created, which is filled by the cartels. Society, no less than nature, abhors a vacuum, and in many ways, the cartels have functioned as the state, and they tax businesses, they create infrastructure, they provide jobs. The money raised, the profits by narcotics industry in Mexico, billions of dollars, some estimates are $30 billion a year, are injected into Mexican banks. They keep Mexican banks afloat. So in many ways, what you're seeing here with the drug war in Mexico is a death match between different sectors of elites trying to assume state powers. And when Felipe Calderón took power in